Hello, good afternoon everyone, and welcome to the 9th episode of Have We Got Planning News for You? My name's Charlie Banner, and on behalf of everyone here, can I thank you all for joining us again. We've got yet another packed show for you today, including our special topic on the recently published policy exchange papers and the calls for a new system of zoned planning. As always, please do continue to provide questions or comments in the Q&A function, not the chat function, the Q&A. We hugely welcome that, as always, and we'll follow up any points after the show that you'd like us to via our LinkedIn page. Please do follow it if you haven't already. The usual reminder, first up, about our encouragement to make a donation to the NHS Clap for COVID Just Giving page, or a charity of your choice. It'd be fantastic if you could do that. Now it's time to introduce the panel. We won't forget Sasha, otherwise known as the Badger, this week. Chris and I should say, at our rehearsal session yesterday, Chris and I basically couldn't stop laughing at the particular side of Sasha's hair that resembles our favourite furry friend. So forgive me.
It's called fashion, Charlie. I know you haven't seen it.
Forgive me. And you know it's a sad day for you when Chris and I can take the piss out of your hair. Anyway, over to you, Mary.
Well, good afternoon, everybody, and hello. My name's Mary Cook. I'm from Town Legal, and I'm in sunny Wandsworth.
And what are you drinking tonight, Mary?
Oh, I'm back on the Tarquins.
As always, good stuff.
Hello, my name is Chris Young, and I'm here in Cheltenham, and I'm joined by my owl Presumption, who, as you can see, has been down the shops now that they're open, and he's come back dressed as Liam Gallagher, because this is the Manchester edition, and in honour of that, I've been down and got myself some Manchester marble beer. And thank you very much for Ben Pycroft, whose birthday is tomorrow, mentioning that. And to start a fight, I've got some North South.
You're in the middle ground. Paul.
Well, I knew that I was following on from Chris, so I thought I'd better retort despite the abuse. So I've got a broadside here. To fire back on behalf of my adopted city, Manchester. And although I'm in Lancashire, I'm just north of Manchester, and just to give you a flavour, that's the Manchester Bee there from the Town Hall, and that's from the Hacienda from Tony Wolfson.
I thought after your kit, Paul, that you were the Manchester Bee after what you wore last week. But
well, in the light of that, what else can I say? It's now my theme.
And Sasha, we remembered you. Badge, what are you thinking?
For once, Charlie, you remember me. Well, because I want to slightly rebalance the panel this week, I'm going very London, and I've got San Pellegrino Limonata. So I thought I'd go London urban, appropriate for Fleet Street. And I also wanted to say, I noticed Chris has got a top of a team that haven't won the league for 8 years. That's obviously my retire. I'm not going to mention last night's catastrophic spineless Arsenal performance. I hope I, as a Gooner, will do slightly better today in the Manchester themed show than my team did last night. They might as well have stayed in London.
Quite a few comments already.
I did want to say, Charlie, I just wanted to say, I know you and I have had quite a noteworthy week, haven't we, on various reasons. And yes. I want to just tell our panellists that every week Chris says, well, it must be the end for West Ferry and it must be falling off the kind of publicity hunt. And then this week, the Daily Mail, that instrument of truth and justice, had the headline on Tuesday was about West Ferry. So every week we have a pattern. Chris says West Ferry must be falling off the pages. Every week it gets bigger and bigger. And now maybe this time next week we might have a new prime minister.
and then your haircut will be featuring the sidebar of shame as a
well, absolutely.
I was telling you, I've been drinking this week a wonderfully named beer entitled Pants Optional. Hope you can read that in honour of remote working and the need only to wear work clothes on top. Chris and I have been debating all week whether the reference to pants is to the English version or the American version. Hopefully, the American version.
Stand up, Charlie. Are you going to stand up and show us?
I wear jeans, not shorts. But the image leaves that to anyone's guess what it actually means.
English.
Now we've got. Our very special guest this week is the author of one of the essays in the most recent policy exchange publication, Planning Anew. Dare we say, without sucking up to you too much, David, the best of the essays, certainly the most enjoyable read. Thoroughly enjoyed it. David is, as you will all know, principal and director of URBED, the Urbanism Environment and Design, Honorary Professor at Manchester University, a past chair of the Academy of Urbanism, and on top of all of that, in 2014. He was the winner of the world famous Wolfson Economics Prize. So we're extremely lucky and privileged to have you with us, David. As usual, our interview with David is in the second half of the show, but we extend our usual welcome to all our guests, so please do join any of our early discussion topics. Particularly, I imagine, David, you'll be very interested to comment on our piece on the policy exchange papers and zoning. Well, before we
hold on, what's David drinking, Charlie?
Say again?
What's David drinking?
Oh yes, what are you drinking, David?
I was just about to say, I got bitten by my dog at the weekend, which is a metaphor of some kind, I'm sure. And so I was given antibiotics, so I'm drinking a cup of tea out of my Wolfson's Economic Prize.
Oh, nice.
Very well. Well, don't break it, whatever you do. Now, I've got something to share with you before we start. Hopefully you can see on my screen now this clip that Chris sent over today of what he's been doing. As Paul and I commented at the time, there's something hilariously comical about this photograph, but we can't quite put our finger on it. So Paul had a very good suggestion that we'd have a caption competition. So here is Chris, all of his own, with Simon Pickles and Inspector Mike Hayden doing a pre-remote hearing test call, and your captions, caption comments are very welcome. Paul, I think you had a starter for 10, didn't you?
Yeah, but I'm not sure it's broadcastable, Charlie.
No, that's true. No, it's mine. We'll leave that to everybody's imagination.
It actually looks like Chris has been so naughty he's got two headmasters giving out a bollocking.
Yes, exactly.
Virtually.
Do you want some more?
That was actually quite scary, Mary.
Our first topic is court case of the week, and Holborn Studios are at it again. Mary, you're going to tell us what happened.
Yes, indeed. So this is the second time a permission to redevelop Holborn Studios has been quashed. And viewers will recall that this is a large photographic studio occupied by leaseholders who are not proposed to be rehoused in the redevelopment scheme here in London. And this case the challenge was successful on two grounds. The first ground was really that the case establishes the public's right to access viability assessments in planning decisions. And let me just remind everybody that last time round, one of the reasons the challenge was successful was because there was a failure to consult on amendments, including at the last minute the complete removal of the affordable housing offer first time round. So second time round, they made a contribution or offer of 757,000, and they supported that with a viability assessment. But that viability assessment, the first version of it, was published by the council with all the numbers blanked out. And the leaseholders specifically asked to see in their consultation response the viability assessment in full so that they could understand it, making the point that unless the viability material was disclosed in full, they couldn't be properly consulted upon it. However, the council did not publish the viability assessment in full, and that was one of the, as I say, the successful grounds of the challenge. And although some of us will recall that there have been previous decisions where the court has indeed agreed to commercial confidences being respected, Dovey, as he's known affectionately by some of us, Mr. Justice Dove to others, but Dovey made the point that the National Planning Policy Framework and indeed the Planning Practice Guidance has changed since some of these earlier cases, and that it's now crystal clear that viability assessments need to be publicly available, to use the NPPF words, and that the Planning Practice Guidance makes it clear that, again, you've got to publish things in full, other than in quotes, exceptional circumstances, and even then you need an executive summary, and that executive summary should contain the benchmark land value and the owner's premium. So that was the first ground. The second ground came about in, I think, slightly unusual circumstances, because, as is often the case, the day before the committee hearing, all members of the committee were written to by the leaseholders, setting out their objections, including, amongst other things, their inability to understand the viability assessments. But the members wrote back saying, thank you, but we're not allowed to read your representations lest they prejudice our determination of the application. And so the second round of the challenge succeeded because the judge found that the public have a right to write to local councillors expressing their views, and that it in fact was a breach of the right to freedom of expression under Article 10 of the European Convention on Human Rights to suggest otherwise. And Dovey, as I like to refer to him, he referred to the Local Governments Association, their publication Probity in Planning, making it clear that lobbying is part and parcel of everyday political, the political planning process. And receiving communications from objectors or indeed supporters of an application is an important part of the democratic process. And so the challenge succeeded on those two grounds. So I think it's really important that anyone coming forward with a viability assessment understands right from the outset that in 9 times out of 10, all the information has got to be publicly available. And there'll only be a very few cases where one can say exceptional circumstances apply. But even then, you can't hide. You must reveal your benchmark land value and your owner's premium.
Paul, what do you make of it?
Couple of thoughts. I agree with everything Mary's just said. But before I start, can I just say how, when you read through the law reports in the planning sphere, how often you see studios brought up. It seems every time there's a studio consent that you end up with a challenge to it. My own personal favourite is not Holborn Studios, but is Working Title Films, which was a studio case involving Andrew Gilbart, my former head of chambers, then Mr. Justice Gilbart, who, bless him, hadn't realised that by using the acronym for Working Title Films throughout his judgment, that he was peppering his judgment with the letters WTF. It was one of the most joyous moments of my entire career when I was able to bounce up to him and say, "You do know what it means, don't you, Andrew?" Bless him. He took it in good spirit and didn't seek to amend the judgment.
I want to say that to Sasha, but we won't go there.
The second mention is of former heads of King's Chambers is to Mrs. Justice Patterson, Frances Patterson, the late Frances Patterson, who in a case called Perry against Hackney came out with a very broad sweeping approach to viability assessments and essentially said you could keep them exempt by and large because they will contain commercially sensitive information. So the Holborn Studios case is very interesting because Mr. Justice Dovey took a different view, and he did so for a couple of reasons. The first reason was MPPF and PPG, which now enforce favouring disclosure, wasn't in force at the time of the Perry judgment. So he drew a distinction. And the second is, I assume that Mr. Justice Dove has had a few of these before writing that particular part of his judgment, because he drew attention to the fact that most viability assessments will have standardised inputs in the form that they are required to by PPG. And it's not an open book assessment. It's a standardized input assessment, and that's why it's not commercially sensitive to produce it. I defy any of my clients to look through their past viability assessments that they put forward to authorities and say, well, yes, all we've done is use standardized inputs. It just doesn't happen. Authorities want to see open book approaches. But what we can say on the light of this case is that if you use commercially sensitive information, that is a good reason to distinguish why your information shouldn't go in the public domain on the back of the Holborn Studios case. But Mary's absolutely right. You need to be aware, sticking in an application, that if it's got viability information in, there's every prospect of it going in as standardized as publicly available information. Thanks, Charlie.
Cheers. That's great. Well, Sasha, what you're going to deal with now, the key pins Secretary of State decision of the week, Love Lane, Woolwich.
I am, and I'm going to take you all on a journey to my spiritual home, because this involves the Royal Arsenal Conservation Area, where in 1886, in the immortal words of Arsenal fans, various workers at the Royal Munitions Factory dreamed up a football team, and the rest is history. Anyway, so this is a case really that is very seminal about 196, and I know I don't want to get Chris going, but we all have our problems with 196 and the balancing exercise. But this is an interesting case because it was 800 units. Poor old Douglas Edwards, who was the advocate for the appellants on this, after the GLA case that we talked about 3 weeks ago. He's having the kind of month that all of us dread and often have. But the basic decision is about 800 houses, a mixed-use scheme. And it's very interesting because the Secretary of State completely endorses the decision of the inspector, Mr. Paul Griffiths, in this case. Now, it's interesting because, firstly, the design proposed is concluded by the Secretary of State to be pleasing and also to say it fits well with its surroundings. So the starting point, you get those two conclusions and you think, well, happy days, this is all going to be good. But then there's a sting in the tail where the Secretary of State says context is everything, and David will enjoy this. Context is everything, and the contextual response is of critical importance. And when I say the 196 balance, it's also interesting because the inspector concludes, which is not disagreed by the Secretary of State, that this was a scheme with 4 substantial benefits: 804 homes, 186 affordable housing units, 217 jobs and an extensive public realm. So on one side, under 196, 4 very substantial benefits. And then in terms of the harms are identified to the conservation areas involved. And the inspector concludes that 2 of those harms at the lower end of the scale of 196 and 2 of the harms are on the middle of the scale. So we're not even talking about the higher parameters. We've all joked when we've looked at proofs of evidence of our conservation witnesses that have this mystical scale in their minds of lower end, the bottom of the scale, the highest end of the scale. But anyway, in this case, the inspector concludes that the harms were either at the low end of the scale or the middle end of the scale. And bear in mind, again, the benefits I've identified. But overall, and those of you who are interested, it is worth looking at the very strong judgment the inspector concludes at para 12107. With that in my mind, and considering the duties upon me, the public benefits of the scheme taken at their highest, and you all expect him to conclude that they are actually overcome the harm. No, they're far outweighed by harm it would cause. And it's quite interesting because I think this is as strong as decision letter on design and the issues of conservation area and section 66 and section 72 for a conclusion that the benefits of that magnitude are far outweighed by the harm, considering we're talking about the middle and the lower end of the 196 scale. It's quite noteworthy in my judgment that the inspectors come forward with such strong conclusions and such a strong recommendation of refusal endorsed by the Secretary of State.
Thanks, Sasha. I agree. I mean, I also agree with you in particular that it's quite unusual how the Secretary of State and the inspector, Paul Griffiths, was an architect himself, and by no means somebody who says no very often. But how they commented on the design, viewed in isolation, was pretty good. Very pleasing, would fit in well. It was simply the contrast between the excessive height and the surrounding area. It does remind me a bit, actually, of there was a scheme that ended up being abandoned for a tall building on the site of the Mildmay AIDS Hospital in Shoreditch, next to Columbia Road, in about 2008. I was for the little 6-party residence at the time, and that was, again, in isolation, a really great, innovative sort of periscope type design with copper cladding. It looked really great in the photo montages, but it would have completely dwarfed the adjacent Columbia Road where the flower market is. There's all sorts of heritage assets in that area. Drew an awful lot of criticism because of that. It was refused planning permission by members on a member overturn, and the appeal was withdrawn and leave the inquiry. And I suppose the moral of the story is one of two things: is either that a great design isn't necessarily enough if it's in the wrong place, or perhaps more accurately, to be a truly great design, a tall building needs to do more than look good on its own. It has to also fit into its context. But either way, an important lesson for the future.
Well, can I just say, Charlie, in the light of your comments, my proudest achievement in practice is getting planning permission for the Carbuncle of the Year award granted by The Guardian in 2011. I have great pride in that decision. I won't name each name.
If you get Prince Charles on the show, then you can raise that with him.
Much of honour, Sasha. Well done.
Well done, Sasha, for putting your papers to your left-hand side and therefore revealing the reason we've been calling you the Badger.
I know. I haven't yet managed to crack it. It's really very, very special indeed, and it must be maintained post-lockdown. Let's move on to a special topic: the policy exchange papers and the issue of zoning. Chris, you're going to kick this off.
Yeah, so everybody at the moment in planning is talking about zoning, and I'm sure some of you will seen a few papers like this. Certainly David will have seen this, and there was an earlier policy exchange document. And so I was interested to know what actually is zoning and how does it work? And as luck would have it, I have a brother who's a surveyor who lives in Western Australia, and they have zoning in Western Australia. And he rings me. He's already got an Australian accent, which I won't imitate, but it is quite annoying. And he says the whole of Western Australia, which is the size of India, is zoned, the whole lot. And where they are in rural Busselton, he is in an R20 zone, and an R20 is basically 20 dwellings per hectare. That's how the subdivisions, they don't talk about estates. If you think about Neighbours, the TV program, that's the subdivision, and they split it up, and that's all there is. So I said what about the city? And he says, well, if you get closer to Perth, which is just 4 hours away down the road, as they say, it's an R80, so you can have up to 80 dwellings a hectare. That's how it works. And when I read David's really, really interesting essay, which we're going to come on to and Paul's going to ask some questions, that's largely what you're describing, a system that is very regimented, very clear. I said to my brother, I said, well, I appreciate in Australia you haven't really got any history, but if you did, what do you do about, listed buildings and heritage? And he bristled a bit. And the position is that he says they do have some conservation areas, but it's a tick in the box. That's all it is. You just tick the box, and that's about as far as the heritage issues go, because you've got your zoning definitions, your height, your building line, and that's it. So zoning is really, really simple. My own view, for what it's worth, is it may well work in modern countries with large open spaces like Australia, like Canada, and probably elsewhere. But for the complexity of the British, small island British countryside and our urban areas and all our heritage, I just think it's far too simplistic. And all we're actually going to see is not the zoning of the UK or the zoning of England. What we're going to see is maybe development corporations that we've seen before, more emphasis on broad locations, maybe more planning in principle when you get an allocation. I just can't see zoning working here. However, I recognise what David's describing, and it certainly sounds like it's got traction and it's going to have some influence going forward.
Thanks, Chris. I mean, my starting point as well is to say this rhetorically: who can argue in principle with the ideal of a simplified planning system that gives efficiency and predictability to developers and investors, whilst also providing accountability to stakeholders and appropriate protection from environmental and cultural assets? I mean, it's up there with peace on earth and goodwill to all men and women. And if it could be achieved, fantastic. So I'm not sort of instinctively against it, but it seems to me that there's 5 particular points that have got to be worked through in relation to most, if not all, models of zoning. And in brackets, add that there are different interpretations of what zoning means. And the 5 kind of things that I think need to work through are, firstly, if you're going to remove planning judgment from the decision-making process, that might actually mean that there are more legal challenges or more successful ones, because the defendant will no longer have planning judgment to hide behind. Things will be much more binary and therefore potentially much easier to challenge, much less evaluative judgment. Secondly, the importance of the zoning plan is going to mean that there will be even more difficult controversies over that plan and litigation incentives for those affected by it. And that seems to me that they're going to have to find a way of making the plan process more manageable, because it's bad enough as it is. I mean, last week we talked about the Leeds plan that took 6 years from start to finish, and finished ended up with them having to go back to either a remittal or a quashing, depending on what the judge decides. So they need to find a way of making the plan making process manageable. Thirdly, echoing what Chris said about heritage, I mean, Jack Airy in his first policy exchange report, as far as I could tell from rereading it a couple of days ago, ducked heritage altogether. He seems to say, well, we'll have to work out heritage too, giving the impression that he saw it as a sort of peripheral issue. Now, it seems to me, and I know, David, you've got some views on this, which may be an answer, but it is a point that's conspicuously missing from detailed consideration so far. Jack Airy seemed to think it was peripheral, but it's not. I mean, almost every planning appeal I've done in the last 3 years has had, to some degree or other, a heritage issue. I'm probably, my guess is you'd all, all of you other barristers would say the same thing. It's not peripheral at all, it's fundamental. Fourthly, what about environmental assessment? I mean, to the extent that it's still considered to be appropriate to subject major development to environmental assessment, even if we do away with the EIA and SEA eventually post-Brexit, but if some kind of environmental assessment is needed, how is it going to be done? Because the zoning plan, it doesn't seem to me, is going to be granular enough to do a meaningful environmental assessment of particular projects. In Hong Kong, where they got zoning in a common law system, and I was there for 6 months in Hong Kong doing planning legal work in a law firm in 2008. And what they do is they have a separate system of environmental permitting for major. So you've got the zoning in the plan, and then stuff that qualifies for their version of EIA has to get an environmental permit, which only looks at the EIA issues and the benefits rather than broader issues. But then you stand back and think, well, does that then just introduce the red tape that the whole point of zoning is to get rid of? But then if you don't have environmental assessment, is that throwing the baby out with the bathwater? Because then the environment takes the hit for planning, growth and streamlining. So there's some difficult issues around environmental assessment to be worked through. And then finally, as a member of the Bar of Northern Ireland and somebody who occasionally practices in Wales and embarrasses myself by my Welsh pronunciation, there's the UK angle. It seems to me that given that planning is a devolved matter, presumably the reforms that the government is talking about, my own judgment is I think this is going to happen. I think this is the government are for real on this. Jack Airy is in number 10, not MHCRG. But presumably they're only going to be England because that's the way that our constitution now works, devolution. If that's right, we're going to be in a position where we've got a conventional Town and Country Planning Act style planning in Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland, each with their own different policy frameworks. In Wales, still presumably with PINs being involved, but zoning in England. And to a potential inward investor looking into the UK from the outside, would those divergences sound attractive, or would adding zoning in part but not all of the UK just make it sound more complex rather than less? And it also means that those who are practicing Wales and Northern Ireland are going to have to keep on top of both the zoning and a conventional regime to keep our practice going. So lots of questions. There may very well be answers. I don't want to be all doom and gloom on this. If they can make it work, it may be good, but there's a lot of work to be done. Dave, I don't know.
Just jump in because the first thing is this is how the rest of the world does planning.
Yes,
we are the exception across Europe, across America, as we've heard, across Australia, Hong Kong, and so on. This is how planning is done. It is a system that was developed originally in Germany and developed and was then adopted and exported to America, and it creates all sorts of types of environment depending on what the rules say. Now, in terms of heritage, are we really saying that London's approach to heritage is better than Rome or Paris? Because Rome and Paris are done in a zonal system, and they have quite a lot of heritage, I think. And you know, the British system of being able to argue everything at every stage of the process is, first of all, incredibly wasteful. Probably quite good for barristers. I accept that, but nevertheless, you know, it just wastes a lot of time. And the point of the system is that you have those arguments at the plan stage. And you do take into account all those things, and having agreed the plan then becomes something which is fixed. And so this is not particularly radical. It's something which is pretty common elsewhere. Well, as we'll talk later, the British system has evolved by precedent and evolution, and to the point where it doesn't really any longer make any sense. And there is a need to rationalise that.
Can I just say quickly, Charlie, you mentioned Northern Ireland. Just had a news update. Northern Ireland has not only reduced social distancing to 1 metre, which I happen to agree with, but they've also opened barbers, which I think is very important for you and me.
I'm on the first plane.
And me?
No, mate, no.
You just need some shaving foam and a big razor, Sasha.
Well, back to reality. David, I've got a series of questions I was going to ask you. The first of which was going to ask you about the realism of zoning. I'm going to come back to that in a minute. Before I do, no, not at all. That's the whole purpose of this. Before I do, can I start up with a bit of hero worship, if I may? I came to Manchester to practice back in 1989. At the time, I used to drive through Hume, and that arc of South Manchester. I had friends in Whalley Range, which is then the red light district. My wife had friends in Moss Side, where I was.
Euphemism.
Where I used to sit in the car and watch the car while she went in to see her friends. So a bit of hero worship that you were involved in the regeneration of Hume, for which there's a massive pat on the back. Whatever you've done since that point is good for me. Secondly, I love this document. When I came in to knowing that you were going to be on this week, I bought this. I'm about halfway through it and enjoying it enormously. Now, that's not just because of the fantastic detailed maps you've drawn in it, but because Manchester starts as the very first of the maps that you've drawn. And I see that the map I've got here, I think, is the same as the map that's directly behind you. Is that right, David?
No, this is 1900 behind me, so that's the present day one now. So yeah, it's developed, it changed a little bit since then.
Well, can I just start off by reading your view about the current system on it, which is planning permission is negotiated, determined by politicians, but there's a quasi-judicial appeals process by which refusals can be challenged. It means that no one is quite sure what a plot of land can be used for until the planning process run its course. The system's created a huge industry of planning consultants and lawyers, all to produce a built environment that satisfies no one.
Yeah.
Discuss. Really, the system that we use?
Can we really disagree with this? You know, I think if planning is to be judged by its outputs, then our planning system isn't working. I mean, you know, I think I wrote a piece for The Guardian, in fact, last year when I said, you know, here's a thought experiment. Go to your favourite urban place in Britain, turn around 3 times and walk for 15 minutes, and where you'll end up will be crap. And it will be crap probably as a result of the planning system or the highway engineer system. It'll be crap because of the system that we have. So I think that is unarguable, that we need to reform the system because of the outputs of it. How we do so is a whole different discussion. I should also say that when I was involved in Hume, I was quite a young planner. This was more than 30 years ago. And so very many people are involved in Hume to take the credit, and I can't take the credit for Hume, although I did actually live there at the time that I was also the planner for the area, which was fairly unique.
Well, and I think you also wrote part of the guide, so that's a massive pat on your back. Well, the reason why you come to that conclusion, in part, David, is because of your analogy with economists, because you say economists recognise that they can't control the system, that they're not in the business of controlling the system. They're merely a dynamic that can affect the system, and that they really only should have provisional views that have to keep being reassessed. Your point is planners don't realise that they're not in control of the system.
Exactly. They haven't worked that out yet. They still labour under this misconception that you draw up a plan and that 20 years later that's what's going to get built. Economists got away from this years ago, and so a lot of the Policy Exchange report comes to that initial conclusion that it's ridiculous to try and predict what's going to happen in 20 years' time. We don't know what's going to happen next year, let alone 20 years' time, and therefore planning is not worth anything. Economists don't think that. Economists say we still have control. We still have levers with which to control the economy, and we can turn it in directions which are positive or negative. You know, we've got taxation, we've got regulation, and so on. And planners have all that as well. So planners can control the city. They just can't predict with any accuracy the outcome of what they're doing, but they can control the direction. And I think that's the point I was trying to make.
But as I understand zoning, the way it would operate under your thesis, and I have to say I completely agree with the proposition that yours is by far the most readable of the essays. It's actually written in a narrative form. But it's also, I think, the most effective because of that, because it's interesting, because you're saying this is how we could be in 2050 if we adopted a zoning approach. But it all starts off from the premise that you would have these very detailed initial plans which set the zones and set the rules for the zones. And that once the rules are set, it's just a matter of, do you tick the boxes to fit in the rules? Local plans are interminable creatures in terms of their preparation now. If we're now going to create local plans that create inflexible rules for the time being, won't that just be a system that's a lawyer's charter, at least at the outset? And don't get me wrong, that's not necessarily a bad thing.
I take objection to the very detailed bit, because I don't think they need to be very detailed. There are simplified planning zones in Holland which have 2 rules, one about party wall condition and one about building line. And basically you can build anything you wish within those 2 rules. And so there doesn't need to be more than a handful of rules. The point being that they're not discretionary once they're agreed. Once they've been agreed, they're non-discretionary. So as we heard from Chris in Australia, that 20 units a hectare rule will have a set of plot parameters for the housing, which relates how the housing sits on the plot. There doesn't need to be many of them. In Holland, the plot passport, as it's called, is a single side of A4 paper. The point is, it doesn't have to be massive reams of information, and therefore it shouldn't be massively difficult to produce, and it should be replicable. Once you've got one which works and you know what the results are, then it can be replicable as well.
But we live in a system where currently councillors agonise about whether we can even start to trip into the greenbelt, where there's overriding evidence of need to trip into the greenbelt. So even the principle of development is hugely politically sensitive. If we say to councillors, your job now, whatever level, strategic or at district council level, is to fix the rules that will be inflexible, that you will be responsible for, but will have no influence over their application as we go on until the plan's reviewed. How do we get that shoehorned into our existing system so that councillors give up control?
Well, no, they don't give up control. They still have control because they have democratic control over the plan. The plan is the point at which that decision is made, as it is today. And I accept that's a difficult thing to do, but I'm not suggesting by any means at all that we give up democratic control of the plan-making process. I'm saying once the plan's finished and agreed, then the implementation of it isn't a political issue because it's already agreed.
But instead of allocate, zone.
Yeah, I mean, whatever you want to call it. You know, I think the policy exchange report was about a binary allocation. You either allocate for development or non-development, and actually all I've done is give a little bit more detail to that, because I think the rules would have to be so broad brush with a single zone of development that they'd effectively become they become meaningless in a sense. So I've said you break that development zone into 4 zones, but what you want to call it is up to you, really.
So explain to me how the 4 zones would work then, David. Sorry, Charlie.
So say again?
Explain to me how the 4 zones would work then in practice.
So a bit like the Australian zone, I suggested 4 zones. So I was thinking of Manchester. So there'd be a zone for the city centre, which probably wouldn't have a height restriction on it, but would have a building line restriction on it, have a plot ratio substantially greater than the plot size. An inner city one, although that would essentially be Hume, that sort of area, for sort of reasonably high dense mixed use inner city developments. A suburban centre one I thought was probably appropriate. So someone like Chorlton would have a mixed use zone for that, and then a general suburban one for everything else, which had a density on it and plot parameters for each of the zones. And if you did that, then different urban form would emerge in each of those 4 zones, and the point being the city then evolves into a set of loose parameters. You're creating fixed but fairly loose fit parameters for development to self-organize into. You then take away all the other controls. So you're not controlling aesthetic, you're not controlling use, you're not controlling all the sort of things that planners get very concerned about, door color, brick types, and so on. That all is not controlled at all, but because you're working within the parameters. And you know, another thing, you go to many cities, Berlin being a very good example, beautiful city with ugly buildings. You know, a lot of the buildings in West Berlin in particular, and well, actually East Berlin, are not particularly attractive buildings, but you don't notice them because the city is so beautiful. It actually follows all the rules. So yeah, it'd be lovely to have great buildings, and you know, in terms of things like design review and so on, it's great to promote great architecture. But planning is something which is dealing with the basics.
David, just one final question for me, then I'll open the rest of the panel. Sorry, Charlie, that's twice I've done that.
Okay.
That's like court.
It's going to be very exciting when it happens. My final question, David, then I'll lead it over to Charlie before he explodes, is in your thesis, where all you have are some very strict parameters, but within those parameters you can do what the stuff you want. How do you avoid the drive to the bottom, i.e. the developer that comes along and does the cheapest, meanest form of development, but still meets the rules?
Well, I think there's an interesting parallel here to the permitted development issues that we've had in recent years, and I admit entirely that what's happened with PD is exactly that. So people have converted former office blocks into flats with no windows, which is outrageous and wrong, and is a Rachman a scandal in the waiting, in my view. You have to control the things that you think are important, and so I mean the policy exchange suggest combining building regs with planning, and I don't necessarily disagree with that. So there are, building regs are fixed, and they're important because they're health and safety and all sorts of things like that. And so things like internal space standards might well be mandatory. Clearly windows should be. I mean, I don't think we should have to be told that windows are mandatory in fact, but apparently we are. So the point being that you fix the things which are important.
Yeah.
And yes, you then have a risk of people to rush the bottom, but the reality is that isn't what happens elsewhere. And I have to say, as my first starting point, this is how the rest of the world does planning.
Yeah.
And you accept some crap, but you don't get all crap. And I'd argue that we get more crap in the UK under our system than you do under one of these zonal systems.
Charlie?
Thank you. Cool. No, the point I was to pick up on it's not my point. It's one of our viewers, Chris, makes a point, and others have actually said the same thing, which is this is all great, but a lot of people from a sort of local authority perspective say, well, how are we going to have the resources to do the level of work that's needed for zoning plans, which are probably going to be an awful lot more work than local plans, given that they're meant to be the job of local plans and the planning development control process. I mean, is it simply a question of merging development control and planning policy forward planning department, so you have fewer people doing DC and more people doing policy? Because that is an issue, isn't it?
Which, of course, is what the Building Better, Building Beautiful Commission suggested.
Yeah.
In fact, they suggested that if you could have a system which is agreed, you could do planning decisions through AI. These things. If there's simple rules, it's actually not that difficult to assess things against the rules. I read this thing which I repeat quite often, which is 60% of planning decisions in France are made over the counter immediately. So you go in, the planning officer and checks the plans, stamps it, and then there's your permission. You walk away with it. Imagine that in the UK.
Don't most of them just go and speak to the mayor and
it's a different
something
system
with a financial contribution? Isn't that how it works in France?
With a nice bottle of wine. I mean, I think that there is some of that. Obviously, in the smaller towns, that might be the way it works. That wouldn't be the case in the larger cities. The case is still the case in point that it isn't. Our development management, it used to be called development control when I did it, system is incredibly time consuming. It takes up a huge amount of time. And when I was a planning officer in Manchester, the department had 150 people in it, half of which did forward planning and half of which did development control, as it was then called. Nowadays, I think it's like 3 people in a broom cupboard doing the plan and everyone else doing development control, because that's just eaten up all the time. So yeah, I think a bit of reallocation of time wouldn't go amiss.
What you've just said, you've conjured up an image of how once zoning has done us all out of a job, how in 20 years' time you go to the Bureau of Planning and behind the glass screen will be Chris going, here's your planning permission.
Yeah, the experience of the last 20 years, the more you reform the system, the more work there is for the lawyers. But
exactly. Yeah.
Sasha, your view?
Yeah, David, I want to ask you, where does the kind of, what's your view on the controls that have come through Europe, environmental assessment and strategic environmental assessment? Where does that fit in the system?
Well, I think the EA system that we have at the moment is a perfect example of the dysfunctional nature of our planning system. I'm a master planner by profession. That's what I do. I prepare plans. In terms of our team, we are the talent. We produce the thing that's being created. And our fee is about 1/3 of the fee of the consultant who gets to do the EA. And what's ridiculous about the EA is that we have to freeze our scheme before they're allowed to assess it. And then having assessed it, and no doubt in the eyes of the people that drew up the system, changed it as a result to mitigate the environmental impacts. We're not allowed to change it because it's been frozen. If we change it, we'll have to redo the EA. So you get this telephone directory thickness document, which no one reads. Maybe barristers read it. I don't know, but no one else reads it.
We're supposed to.
And it's cost an awful lot of money. It costs, hundreds of thousands of pounds to produce, and it's completely useless. Now, the reason for having an EA was perfectly reasonable. And I think the point Charlie made earlier about, how do you take account of local environmental factors like that newt pond or whatever that the code can't possibly know about, is a perfectly good one. And we do need a system to take account of local environmental impacts. But the EA certainly isn't it, in my view.
But haven't you just beautifully demonstrated why it is that the EA is used in the rest of Europe under the directive? Because under the rest of Europe, you don't have the same detail that we have. We've just simply duplicated because we've got a different system. We take account of those things anyway.
Absolutely right.
I'm the most ardent Remainer you could ever hope to meet. But if the consequence of Brexit is we get rid of EIA and SEAs, then that's at least one tiny little benefit. Vectorless sea of disaster. Chris, do you have a question?
I do. I'm going to imagine I've sort of adopted zoning now. I'm accepting. I've moved on to my second marble beer, which is called West Coast, and I'm in the West Coast of Australia, and I believe in zoning. Jack Airy's essays are pretty radical. Where do you disagree with him? Where do you think he's got it wrong?
I think my concern, to be honest, with what Jack was writing was more about how it was going to be interpreted rather than actually what he said. I mean, he initially wanted to have no zoning at all. I mean, no allocation. So basically a national set of rules for developments, and you could build wherever you wanted, which of course was what we had between the wars, you know, and there was a thought process within the people involved in this. The planning is essentially a constraint on the market, and planners have no ability to. Planners don't have the ability to manage markets, and therefore they make markets less efficient, and therefore they should just get out of the way. And that seems to me entirely untenable as a process, because I mean, as in all markets, you know, the results of unconstrained markets aren't necessarily very pretty. They're not very equitable, they're not very environmentally sound, and so on. You do need to control these things, and planning is the mechanism we have to do that. And so actually in conversation with Jack, we got to the point where we had these, we got to this single allocation, which does rather undermine their logic a bit, because someone's got to decide how big that allocation is, which is therefore planners, and therefore they are involved in the market. So there is a logical inconsistency in the argument because they conceded that point. Having said that, then taking a national set of rules, as I said before, I would have a much more fine-grained set of codes rather than a single allocation for the whole country. Of course, the government is in the process of tendering for a national model design code at the moment, which will address this issue head on, albeit without the powers at the moment to implement it, but the idea being that local authorities would adopt it. So, you know, I think it's an interesting, I feel myself as a generally, you know, Guardian reading, left-leaning planner, and I always feel slightly uncomfortable agreeing with people on the sort of right wing of the policy exchange about these things, but there is a weird confluence of sorts of thought in this area. The planners and the policy exchange obviously see it as deregulation. You know, maybe there's the American system of planning. Mine's more Scandinavian, perhaps, sort of mixed economy, combination of regulation and taxation to create a much more equitable system. But actually the mechanism in the middle of all that is actually we probably share a view of.
Mary, do you have any questions for our surprisingly, almost exceptionally left-wing Guardian reading planner? There must be so few of those around, David.
No, there's hardly any. No, yeah.
I'm going to ditch my question, and I'm going to pick up the question raised by my namesake, although we're not related. And this is Andy Cook's question, and he says, with inflexible zoning, how would you accommodate technology and technological revolutions, for example, solar farms?
Well, the first thing is that the point about the parameter-based, form-based zoning is it's very loose fit, and so there should be a huge amount of scope to do what you wish within the loose fit zoning. So we're not micromanaging anything here, and so it should be possible to do that. So, for example, Midtown New York was zoned as suburbia, believe it or not. When that was initially zoned, it was supposed to be suburban villas, but no one put any height control on it, and so you got something very different. So this is not a restrictive way of planning. However, if something like solar farms happens, which is out with the code, then the code should be updatable. I mean, the point about this is you need a feedback loop, because you're creating a set of parameters to generate a result which is predictive. And if the result isn't what you predicted, and if there are downsides to it, you need to change the parameters. So it's important that this isn't a once and for all, I've done this and therefore I'm never going to change it again, because that way lies, you know, Alan Batrow did a book recently called Pattern something or other, which was very critical of this approach. And he talked about his early days working in Algeria when he was being asked to apply the French imperial code to an Algerian town, and it just wasn't fitting at all. A bad code is a bad thing. Therefore, we need the chance to change it.
I wonder if the way to kill zoning perhaps is to suggest to the government that fundamentally it's based upon the Code Napoleon, and the idea that Boris would introduce a Napoleonic code to the UK may perhaps not sit well with him. David, thank you very much indeed. That's been extremely enlightening. I could sit and listen and chat to you for the rest of the evening, but we've run out of viewers, I suspect. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Charlie?
Thank you very much
before Charlie comes on, just to say, Charlie, you and I heard there was a fly past. It was delighted. We just talked about Code Napoleon. We had the red arrows 2 minutes to 5 flying over because Macron's at dead number 10.
Oh, is that why he is? Oh, perfect timing. We need to move on, and we've got champion and nudge of the week. And Chris, you're going to tell us who is your champion and who you want to up their game.
Yeah, okay. I'm going to start on the naughty step with Mr. Pincher, who is, as we know, one of the ministers in the department, the planning minister, who accidentally might have revealed the outcome of a Secretary of State appeal decision before he should have. It was a debate about, of all things, Westbury Printworks. And that story just keeps rolling, doesn't it? And the best way to defend the Secretary of State was, the planning minister thought, to make his own cock up and to reveal the outcome of a decision. I'm a massive fan of In the Thick of It. And I just can see the scene now. Right, Minister, okay, we've told you about these cases, but obviously, please don't mention those when you're speaking to others, and definitely don't mention it in the House of Commons because that's televised. Okay, I've got that. Right. He's in there. He's under pressure. Yeah, and he says, and what about the decision? Oh, no, I'm not meant to have mentioned that. Hopeless, honestly. Anyway, that's enough of that. The champion of the week is my very own Cheltenham Borough Council. Cheltenham Borough Council have decided that they've listened to the businesses in the town, and as you know, I'm a resident of Cheltenham, and we love our restaurant society and our quasi-cafe society when it's not raining like today. And the businesses have said, if you don't help us, we're going to go under before the summer. And so what they've decided to do is free a significant number of planning restrictions, licensing restrictions, and public health restrictions. And they basically said to businesses, put up marquees, put up what you want within certain areas, in the parks, in the town centre. Speak to us about what you're planning to do, but you don't need to fill out any forms. We want your businesses to thrive in Cheltenham. We want them to do well. Please see this as a green light to open up your businesses in a way that is consistent with social distancing. And hence you heard my comment, I really think we should drop down to a metre. It's schools have been pointed out in Northern Ireland that have dropped to a metre. And they made it a one-stop shop. If a business needs to get going, go and see Cheltenham Borough Council. Tracy Cruz, I spoke to this afternoon. They're very keen to be very positive about this. They're the first authority in the country to do this. And let's hope every other authority takes that view and makes it really easy for businesses to do what they need to do. Well done, Cheltenham.
Thanks, Chris. Now, we promised, we had a caption competition. Hopefully the image is on the screen. We had lots of great offers, but the best one, I think, is, from my view, is from Daniel. The caption being, coming from the guys on the screen, I'm somewhat concerned, Mr. Young, you keep moving closer to the screen. I think we're going to have to recommend a trip to Barnard Castle. So thanks for that, Daniel. Well, that's it for this week. Thank you all so much for joining us again, and particularly thank you for David for that really fascinating insight on how, amongst other things, how zoning might work. And that's certainly some thought-provoking things that might even make, I'll certainly reflect on what you said, particularly on the heritage angle. So thanks for that.
Charlie, before you close, there are 2 points I just want to quickly make. One, Sefton have now put up what we mentioned a couple of weeks ago, which I just want to confirm because I've had about 100 emails saying, where can I find it? And Paul will confirm that's happened. And second of all, the one thing you asked me to mention, remind you, was the UKLA conference.
Yes. I was about to come on to that, Sasha. You read my mind. It was almost as if we got a script. I have as a soon to be standing down council member of UK Environmental Law Association, I have been asked to give a shout out, which I'm delighted to the UK Environmental Law Association annual conference next week, Thursday and Friday. It's taking place digitally. It's free for UK members. There's some really high quality speakers and me, and details are on the UKLA website. So have a look on that, and please do join if you can. Please don't forget that considering a donation for the NHS or charity of your choice, we'll be here same time, same place, same meeting code and ID next week with another special guest, which we'll reveal early next week. Thanks very much for coming. Thanks again, David, for your insight, and cheers, everybody. Have a great weekend.
Cheers.
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 Brilliant.